just going to give a brief introduction and then I'll hand over to our speakers. So by way of introduction, Köken Ergun studied acting at the Istanbul University and completed his postgrad degree in ancient Greek literature at King's College, London, followed by an MA in art history. After working with American theatre director Robert Wilson, and I think becoming somewhat dissatisfied with the restrictions of live performance, Köken became more involved with video and film. His multi-channel video installations have been exhibited internationally at exhibitions and institutions including Documenta, Palais de Tokyo, Salt in Istanbul, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Kiasma in Helsinki, Digital Art Lab in Tel Aviv, and Parasite in Hong Kong. Marilyn Lake is a professorial fellow in history at the University of Melbourne. She is the author of several books on the impact of war on Australian society, including What's Wrong with Anzac, written with Henry Reynolds, Mark McKenna and Joy Damusi. She is an elected fellow of the Academy of Humanities in Australia and of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. Between 2010 and 2014, she served as president of the Australian Historical Association, which is the peak national body for Australian historians. Her next book, which is titled Progressive New World, How Settler Colonialism and Trans-Pacific Exchange Shaped American Reform, will be published by Harvard University Press in 2018, this year. So Artspace is very proud to be showing The Wonderful Heroes, which is a co-commission between Artspace, the Australian War Memorial and Proto Cinema. And the development of this commission started about 3.5 years ago when we hosted 4 visiting curators from Turkey, one of whom was Mari Sparida, who's the director of Proto Cinema. And on her visit here, we connected Mari with the War Memorial, and in particular with Warwick Haywood and Ryan Johnson, who were then working there. And we began to talk about who might be able and interested to develop a unique work for their collection. And of course, Köken came to mind, and so began the discussion. And I think it's pertinent to note that he's the only Turkish artist to have been commissioned by the War Memorial and the only Turkish contemporary artist in their collection. I won't go into too much detail about the film because I think Köken and Marilyn will do a much better job of unpacking it. But it is interesting to note that it's been realised over the last 3 years by Köken, working closely with tour guides from Turkey, from Australia and from New Zealand. And for the process, he's documented more than 50 tours to the region. And we have been lucky enough from Artspace to visit Köken in Istanbul over the last few years a few times, both during its development and the production phases. And most recently we were there in October to watch some rushes and got really excited, and even more excited to have the final film here. So I won't say too much more other than to thank our partners again, the War Memorial and Proto Cinema, and to congratulate Köken on a wonderfully insightful and important work. The film is downstairs screening until the 12th of May. It's 88 minutes long, and I would encourage you to take the time to watch the whole thing. I think we'll see some excerpts tonight, but very much worth watching it in totality. And we'll have time for some questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. So shall we begin by looking at the beginning of the film?
Yeah, we'll show you first 3 or 4 minutes, and then we start making our conversation.
Evet, sevgili misafirler, bundan 102 yıl önce yapılan savaşlarla adını tarihe altın harflerle yazdıran Şehitler diyarına, Çanakkale'ye hoş geldiniz. İsmim Nihat, emekli denizaltı subayım. Bugün savaşın geçmiş olduğu 33.500 hektarlık bir alanda yaklaşık 120 kilometre yolculuk yapacağız. Çanakkale savaşları 2 bölümden oluşur. Bunlardan bir tanesi bir günlük deniz savaşı. Türk'ün iman gücü ve o inanmışlıkla vatan müdafasını yapıp Çanakkale geçilmez dedirttiği olayların yaşanmasından sonra Türk'ün zaferiyle sonuçlanmıştır. Ve düşman Çanakkale'yi denizden geçemeyince karadan geçmek için askerlerini Mısır'da eğitirler. Bunlar İngilizler ve Fransızlardır. Bir de kandırılmış ordu dediğimiz Anzaclar vardır. Yani Avustralya ve Yeni Zelanda birliklerinden oluşan.
Okay, I'm Professor Marilyn. I'm a historian from the University of Melbourne, and it's my great pleasure to be here tonight. It's a real privilege to speak to Köken about his wonderful film. I found it a really striking film, and it sort of highlighted the paradox of Gallipoli and Anzac for us in Australia, because in a way it's both so familiar but also so foreign. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, struck me about this movie, and I'd really love it if Australians could all see it. Also, I'd like to thank Artspace for inviting me up here to be in conversation with Köken. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners, custodians of this country on which we meet. So there's so many questions. How many of you, just an indication, how many of you have seen the whole film? Only about a third, okay, because sort of it's interesting, you know, it's important it's important for us to know how many are familiar with it and how many not in terms of talking about it. So there are so many things, so many themes, subjects, topics that we could discuss in relation to this film, and in the context of a sort of comparative approach to particularly the Anzac landing, as it used to be called, or the invasion that took place on the 25th of April 1915. But I thought we would start. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck by with the very opening of the film was the soundtrack. And it's an interesting documentary in a way, in that there's no narrative voiceover. There's no narrative, someone telling you what to think about it or what the meaning is. It's in your face, you know, you make meaning of it as you go. And the first thing I think that strikes one is the soundtrack, which Köken explained to me before what it was, and maybe if you could just do that for the audience.
Yeah, for those people who are not familiar with what we were hearing in the very beginning of the film, it's not a call to prayer, it's the Selah, S-E-L-A. It is a special extra prayer most Fridays, which is the holy day for the Muslims, when the holiday, Friday noon prayers and going to the mosque is an important ritual. And this selah is added after the prayer, call to prayers. But also, it is chanted or played now in playback in the old times when the Ottoman Empire or any Muslim army was going to the war, which is called the jihad. And contemporary example is when the failed military coup attempt happened in Turkey last year, on the 15th of July, when the current President Erdogan realized that he was winning over. He ordered all the mosques in the country to broadcast the selah, which scared a lot of people because it is the court of holy war. So, and this is happening after that failed coup attempt, and they are waking up. Shall I talk about this ritual as well?
And the loudspeakers.
About?
And the loudspeakers. I mean, how it comes.
How it is played? Well, I mean, you see the scouts are there, and then the other group who are camping, and they are woken up by the cannons. And the first call to prayer happens, and then the selah happens. Some of them pray, and this is the evolution. They're washing themselves. So it's a restaging of a Muslim army going to war, basically. And this is interesting because what you see here is an invented tradition, following the terms of one of my favorite historians, Eric Hobsbawm, who coined it. So, this is happening during the Anzac Day, when the dawn ceremony is taking place in Anzac. The last 5 years, the state has organized the scouts and the campers to go there. They come from all over the country. That's why they're holding the banners that's showing where they come from. Historians argue that there hasn't been such a march on the Turkish side, such a large march to where Çanakkale is, the highest point in the Gallipoli Peninsula. Because there were soldiers deployed at Çanakkale who were actually the snipers who were shooting the Anzacs when they came ashore. This we all know. What happened is the Turkish state copied from the Anzac dawn ceremony. So we see states looking at each other. We talk about other things that they borrow from each other. So they're making the kids wake up, make them pray, and then apply henna on their hair. And this is a sacrificial, ritualistic mark. Henna is applied to virgin women the day before their wedding, in an all-female ritual called the henna ritual, which men are not allowed. And the henna is done to the palm of their inner hand, and it looks bloody red. So it's actually representing the blood that they will lose when they lose their virginity the next day, assuming that they are virgins. But it also is applied to sacrificial lambs prior to the sacrificial feast, where the Muslims are sacrificing lambs, beef, which is coming from Abraham's tradition when he wanted to kill his son and God sent him the sheep. In the tradition, it is said that soldiers going to war, their mothers, and we'll come back to the mother subject separately, are applying henna on the young soldiers' hair. So this is what they're doing. So that's a pastiche of many different rituals. So you borrow from the Anzacs, you borrow from this old tradition, which is not entirely true. Many historians say. I'm not an historian, I'm just representing what they think. And then there is a food, there is a menu. The menu is just aşı çorbası, it's a soup with corn inside and one loaf of bread. Also, historians are arguing that this is not possible because army needs good proteins and carbohydrates. So to make the narrative more emotional and more pitiful, they're saying they had only this to eat. So they are waking up and given this food in a row. And then they're set up on this road, which you see the rest of the film is showing their path up to Çanakkale, while the Anzacs are also walking up. So this is a new tradition for the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And we've been talking about as well the way that Anzac Day in Australia has been, the changes that have been going on in the commemoration of Anzac Day since the 1920s over the last 100 years. That these commemorations change historically as the circumstances in which we live change. And they also change in response to the intervention and actions by the state in both countries. And so we can come back to talk about that a bit later, but I thought first I'd like to know from Köken why he decided, and in conjunction with other partners and sponsors, why you decided to make this film.
I mean, I normally try not to take commissions because I want to be free in my decision of what to work on, and then I invite institutions on board. This is what I'm working on. If you want to be partners with it, or if you want to show it, let's show it. The works usually take a lot of time, 2 or 3 years in developing and shooting, embedding myself in communities. I do works about rituals, and this is for me another ritual, a set of rituals, a heaven of rituals, let's say. So when the War Memorial offer came to me through the partners Artspace and Produce Cinema that Talia mentioned, at that time we were having elections, and in the neighborhood where I lived, first of all, nationalism is growing in our country, like in many countries. And there was a pogrom against the pro-Kurdish, pro-LGBT, pro-left, pro-feminist HDP party by ultra-nationalists. And that was a bit scary because pogroms can lead to something else. So this was the background when the phone conversation was happening, and I always knew that there was a tourism going that way. So we'll talk about that also, tourism of martyrdom, as they are coining now in the Turkish academia. So I wanted to know why the country is going towards this nationalist, ultra-nationalist turn, and what made Erdogan even change his religious tone into a nationalist tone. So I thought I should do this, and this is what I think I use art as to inform myself about what's going on. I wanted to go to Çanakkale anyway. I wanted to see where this is the core of this nationalism. Çanakkale, or Gallipoli, is what brings everybody together in Turkey, because it's so polarized. Everybody, like, either you love this part or that part. This is exactly what Trump is trying to do, and we are an early example of that policy in Turkey. So we knew, and I heard, that Çanakkale was the main common factor. And I said, that's a great offer, why don't I go to Çanakkale? And I told the War Memorial and Artspace, I said, this is going to take a long time. So that's how it started.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And what did you learn over that 3 years?
First of all, as you said, I'm 41 now. When I was 12, 15, maximum 18, when high school trips were going there, Çanakkale wasn't popular. Çanakkale is not even a national day in Turkey. It is a national day, a commemoration, but it's not an off day like Anzac Day. There are other days of the Turkish Republic. So I realized that with the Erdogan regime, it changed, and he put more pressure on Çanakkale because it is the Ottoman past, whereas the previous, more Republican parties would kind of not completely ignore, but it was something that is celebrated mostly by the army, and it wasn't in the national curriculum that much. Because it's the Ottoman army fighting, first of all, not the Turkish Republic, and secondly, we lost the war. Çanakkale is a victory that lasted a short time, because then Istanbul was invaded. The First World War was lost, so you don't celebrate a war because they look at it as a big war, not just a battle. But Erdogan, following this neo-Ottoman idea, which in my opinion has completely failed, and he didn't succeed in doing that, tried to found institutions in the area which would promote more a surge of tourism, and in fact it is real tourism now, because he and his municipality started these free excursions on buses, which is why you see a lot of buses in this film. A municipality in Turkey started, the legendary Zeytinburnu municipality, to do the first free tours. So this was an occasion opportunity for people who wouldn't be able to afford a trip to Çanakkale, to get on a free trip, to be served their food, and to come back the next day. So what they do is that they get on the bus midnight from all parts of Turkey, and then they arrive near Gallipoli, and that's when I get on board. And I tell them about my project. All of them always gave permission. And then I follow them with my camera, but in the first year I didn't use any camera, I was just sitting there as a normal audience. And then they are rushed from one monument to the other, There's a lunch break. After lunch, usually everybody eats extraordinary amounts of free food served to them, so they fall asleep in the bus, which is the part when I also don't shoot because they was really sleeping. And then they rushed again until 5 o'clock and then sent back to where they came from. They don't even visit the Çanakkale city, which is on the other side. So this is pure tourism, and also there's a lot of merchandise being sold. The lunch is arranged with a restaurant, which will have a big revenue of 10 buses a day or something. And on the other side, I also felt that it could be the same with the Anzacs, and I realized that it was the same. There is a tourism of Anzac Gallipoli remembrance. Very few people come to Gallipoli just because they want to come only to Gallipoli. It's usually in an itinerary which is supported by many beach trips. Greece, Turkey beach trips, fun trips. Old or young, they are always coming with these tour companies. And I embedded myself in 2016 with the most joyful, young and crazy tour company called The Fanatics, which you see in the film with the yellow hoodies. Also another tourism aspect is the fact that back in 1915, some Anzac soldiers, young people, they joined the army with their own will because they wanted to see the world outside of Australia.
Yeah, and it's true that these battlegrounds and military commemoration has become a major part of tourism, overseas tourism in Australia. I mean, so many young backpackers make the trek to Gallipoli, then they often go, or used to go, to Istanbul. And I was remarking before, some of you might have heard in the last few days, there's been a lot of attention on the new multi-million-dollar memorial being built at Villers-Bretonneux in France, called the Monash Museum or whatever. I think it cost $100 million. Can you imagine? Our federal government has just spent that amount of money on a new art museum, commemoration museum. And that will now serve, of course, as a reference point for lots of tourists who will want to go to Paris. And so, these new memorials and new rituals become an integral part of international tourism, which is really interesting. We were also talking about sacrifice and the role of mothers. Mothers have quite a central part in Köken's film and his sort of representation of how this is reenacted in Turkey. Whereas I was suggesting that mothers don't have such a major role to play in Anzac commemorations. We were thinking about that. Will we play a bit more of the film which features the theme of sacrifice? And so one of the points in the Turkish context is to emphasise sacrifice on the part of men and women. That women make the sacrifice of sending their sons and their wives, as boys and men make the sacrifice, of going to war. So, and there are these dramatic reenactments that take place to make this point. So.
And we have to add also the detail is that speaking about states' intervention into the narrative building or history making, these theatre plays that you see are commissioned by the Turkish state to be played there every 15 minutes every day over a period of 4 months. Because there is a season. The season starts in March, ends in October. Actually, it's more than 4 months. And there's also a season for the Anzacs to come because they need to combine it with beach holidays. So few people, of course, come to the 25th of April, but it's way too cold for the beach, even for Australians. So the majority of the people as backpackers tours come in the summertime.
Şehit isteme benden makber, Hazreti Peygamber.
Sözümüz, rüyamız bu muydu Hamza?
Sevdiğim, metin ol.
Yıllardır askerden dönmeni bekledim. Acı bir haberi, yüreğim çarparak her an bekliyordum. Kabuslarla uyanıp dualar ettim. Allah'ım, düşman kurşunlarından seni korusun diye. Döndüğünde dünyam cennetim oldu. Şimdi ise şu halime bir bak. Evlendiğimiz gecenin sabahı beni bırakıp tekrar cepheye gidiyorsun. Beni özlemeyecek misin Hamza?
Bütün ruhum seninle olacak. Ve her anım seni düşünerek geçecek.
Günlerin ateş, barut, kan olacak. Oysa rengarenk kır çiçeklerini sana vermek isterdim. O tepelerde, vadilerde seninle dolaşmak isterdim. Ama rüyamız bozuldu.
Sevdiğim, bana vereceğin emanetlerin anlamını bir düşün. Eğer ben düşmanı topraklarımızdan kovmaya gitmezsem, emanetlerimiz yere düşer. Seni ve beni yaradan Allah şahidim olsun ki, ben geri dönmesem bile, şehit haberim ile beraber, bana emanet edeceklerinin tamamını sana getirecekler.
Artık bana sabır düşer. Yaradanımın bana verdiği bu canı alana dek seni bekleyeceğim. Yüreğimde, dualarımda seninle olacak.
Verdiğin bu emanetler başımın tacıdır, şerefimdir. Andolsun ki Çanakkale'de basılan her toprak, her tepe, şehit kanıyla sulansa da bu emanetler asla yere düşmeyecektir. Elif, seni çok seviyorum.
Çanakkale
Yes, I find this interesting for numerous reasons. I mean, the large part that reenactment plays, because there are several other reenactments as well in the commemoration and the making meaning of it. And as I said, the theme of sacrifice, and that the sacrifice is equally on the part of women as men. And also the response of the audience, the women in the audience, you know, crying. I mean, deeply moved by this. So as I said, I mean, to someone who knows about the Anzac tradition, you know, back to front, I found this perspective on what in many ways is a familiar terrain, but I found it sort of so completely foreign. I mean, it's just fascinating to me that, you know, the two sides who fight, as it were, in that war then commemorate it in rather different ways. So I thought, you know, gender is really important, and it's interesting to think about the role of gender in the Anzac tradition as well as in the Turkish tradition. But equally, as Köken was saying, I find it really interesting that this is a sort of invented tradition commemoration of the last 5 years that Erdogan has promoted. What's really interesting is that continuity with the Ottoman Empire. So rather than celebrating the Republican break, it's establishing a continuity that goes way back. And I think there's a similar ambiguity in Anzac. You know, on the one hand, it's meant to be an intensely, you know, the birth of our nationhood, a sort of national moment. But on the other hand, of course, the paradox is the Anzacs are there at the behest of the British Empire. I mean, they're there not to fight against the British Empire, but for the British Empire against other empires. So I think, you know, there are so many similarities and differences and contrasts that, you know, we could think about and talk about. So we're both interested in the role of emotions and why some events and commemorations call up such emotions, and also the manufacture of emotions, you know, that emotions are not, as it were, just spontaneous things. They change over time. I mean, there's a sort of manufacture of emotions that has changed over 100 years in both countries. And we were talking, I wondered with Köken about the response here to his film, you know, the response both on the part of Australians as well as on the part of, you know, what might happen back in Turkey. I wondered what the responses back there will be to this movie, how they read it, and whether people would be upset. Because one of the things I think we've both discovered, that in this resurgent sort of nationalism and military commemoration in both countries, these things increasingly stir deep emotions in people. And I found that when I first started writing about the mythology of Anzac about 10 years ago now, you know, I gave lectures in Melbourne, and there was stuff in the Age newspaper and online and things, and I was quite shocked by the angry reaction amongst a section of the population, you know, that clearly regarded Anzac as sacred. And that book, What's Wrong with Anzac, the work of 4 of us came out about that, What's Wrong with Anzac. I mean, this induced amongst some people sort of fury, you know, and we were accused of being traitors, and, you know, we didn't, you know, what right did we have to speak about this? So, I mean, that's interesting too, about why people feel so emotional about military history and the depiction and the commemorations of military history. I wonder if you want to say anything about that, Köken.
I think I'm going to experience similar things that you have experienced after writing this article. In this book, I strongly recommend, this is how I actually knew of Marilyn, because the curators at the War Memorial sent me a huge box of books, and this was the most interesting because this is one of the few critical voices. But we have to give them credit that in the box, in my Christmas box, they included this book. So, for example, in her introduction, Marilyn is writing about one of the commentaries, or actually it's an email to you in 2009. My question is, what have you done for your country? Please no lecturing, you haven't earned the right. And there are several others here. I'm actually experiencing something similar right now on Twitter. I just searched my name, and there was an ABC coverage about this film, and people without even seeing the film, they were saying this mock-up artist filmmaker should not have been invited to our country, and the same person said this film should be burned at Anzac Day Dawn ceremony this week. It's obviously an army-related person whose husband since 66, it says, so an elder person. And then another voice says, I was first shocked that a Turk was asked to make a film about it, but then I was happy to see that he was showing the side of the Turkish community who was actually against the Australians coming to Turkey. And so we have to stop being naive, and we have to understand what's happening. So coming back to the emotional level of this, in the Eastern Mediterranean cultures, people cry easier than Australia. And we laugh easier than Australia.
I don't know about that.
No? I think we are laughing. I think this is an observation that I have. And a couple of people who saw the film here, they told me how fascinated they were about the comfortable, this expelling of these emotional reactions. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But crying is part of many rituals of mourning. And this is a ritual of mourning. But a detail, before Erdogan, in the more secular hardline celebrations, The theater pieces will be mostly men and very militaristic. There will be no crying. You cannot cry as a soldier. But that didn't really work in that community. I mean, this is one of the things that people are discussing about the, I'm going to use that word, political engineering of, public engineering of the Republican era. So that was a very harsh, masculine, militaristic, probably somehow similar to the Anzac ceremonies here, where women are absent or in the background. So this is a successful attempt, and it's really being quite successful. So people are crying, and you don't see it in the film, but the actors who are playing this over and over again, very low-paid actors, young soldiers, they have to sit in the shade in July, waiting for the other 15 minutes to start. And then they're never left alone. All these mothers are coming and touching them, making selfies, and they think they're taking pictures with soldiers. It's working. So it's really interesting for somebody who comes from a background of theater, and then as Talia says, I'm discontent, I have discontent with theater, so I'm interested in bad acting. And I think God loves me, or the angels love me. When I was going there for 2 years, in the beginning it was a bit dry. I was like in tour guides, listening. I said, okay, I listen to this, I listen to that. How am I going to make this film? And then suddenly I saw this theater, and I said, this is fantastic. It's like Çanakkale in a nutshell, or Gallipoli in a nutshell. And you were asking me whether the Anzac rituals have any of these theatrical. No, I think they don't. You know, you see people in 2016 when I embedded myself with the Fanatics, when I had absolutely no camera on me, and I spent 3 days with a quite radical young group of people. Few people were emotional, and very few people were crying, because as soon as everybody got up, I was like looking around to see like what the reactions would be. You're right. I mean, they are not using it now, but from your book and from other writers, from the writers in your book who have made other speeches, I've been following their speech. During the conscription campaign in 1915, we have documents showing that there were poetries written on this period, graphic design, and a mother is calling for conscription. Can you please talk about that? Because you have it.
We were talking about the historical change in the history in both countries. And I mean, it's interesting the way that history, as it were, and commemoration shape each other and interact, but it's a dynamic relationship, and it's changing all the time. Until fairly recently in Australia, until 20 or 30 years ago, histories of the impact of World War I on Australia used to always emphasise the conscription campaigns. In 1916 and 1917, Australia was the only country, by the way, in World War I not to have conscription, which is a really significant thing about our participation in the war. Every other country forced men to go to fight. Here there was a vote, plebiscites, 2 of them, bitterly fought, bitter campaigns. And in both cases, the people said no to conscription. We wouldn't force men to go and fight against their will. What's significant, there's several significant things about that. One is that in Australia, women already had the vote. Australians were the first in the world to give women full political rights, that is the right to vote and to stand for the National Parliament. New Zealand women had the right to vote but not stand for the National Parliament in the 1890s. So this is one of the things that characterises Anzacs or Australasia. But what happened during the conscription campaigns is that people fought bitterly, trying to persuade everybody to vote yes or no. Both sides were incredibly invested. And in those campaigns, I was saying to Köken, there was a lot of bad verse and other sorts of arguments that often invoked mothers. And in Australia, mothers were in a rather contradictory position, because on the one hand, people called to their instincts as mothers either to not send their sons to kill another mother's darling boy, as one of the pieces of verse said, or they appealed to mothers to help the boys already there, that don't abandon them. So on both sides, mothers were appealed to as mothers. But the contradiction was, women, because they already had the vote and they were going to vote in these conscription campaigns, Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, even threatened at one point to take the vote off women in case they voted the wrong way, in case their maternal instincts got the better of them and they wouldn't send people to the front, which is in fact what happened. I mean, they voted no. So, so history, what we take from history and what we remember from history and what we commemorate changes all the time, and changes as often as not under political direction. And it's interesting about Erdogan and 5 years, because one of the key changes in the great upsurge in Anzac commemoration in Australia was the election of John Howard as Prime Minister in 1996. And he took a really personal interest in promoting Anzac commemoration and channeled millions of dollars from the federal budget into this all over the place. And one of the contexts in which he did that, as historians have pointed out, was the so-called history wars. All the history being written about frontier massacres, about the massacre of Aboriginal people in the settlement of Australia. And there was so much of that kind of black armband history, as he called it, that in some ways when Howard became Prime Minister, he used his position and his resources to change the subject. He just wanted to change the subject. And he did change the subject by getting us all to focus on overseas wars. Don't talk about frontier massacres or colonial occupation. Let's look at all those overseas wars. And we've been looking at those overseas wars, ever since, the continuity from the Boer War to World War I to World War II, right through to the present day. So we've just got, we want to have some questions and answers, and we also thought we might show, for those who've not seen the film, and it's really, we haven't talked much about the depiction of the Anzacs in their commemorations as pilgrims going to the front. There's a clip we might show of a young New Zealand woman who's part of a Kontiki tour. A lot of young Australians and New Zealanders go there as part of backpacker tours.
You're almost there.
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost.
Did you join the lawn pine ceremony?
No.
No.
We've just been wandering up.
You're the Kiwis?
Yeah, we're the Kiwis.
Okay. I'd say 5 more minutes and you're there. Why do they make you walk?
To feel the pain they felt.
Really?
Maybe. Well, it's somewhat nice and poetic.
It's nice, yeah. Yeah. So you can experience the...
I mean, here we are.
The area, yeah.
On a nice day.
Mm-hmm.
Minimal clothing, minimal packs. They're probably not that great a day. Rifle weighs at least 15 kgs on its own.
Mm-hmm.
With their packs.
Mm-hmm.
And sick. What else we can do, I guess?
First time here?
Yes.
How do you feel?
I cried this morning.
Oh.
And as soon as they started rolling the names on the screen, I cried.
Did you have relatives?
My great uncle,
Mm-hmm.
he was killed on the Western Front.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was 19 when he got sent over, and
Yeah.
about 6 months before the war ended, he got killed.
Mm-hmm.
I guess everyone's got relatives somewhere.
Mm. What was the best part of the ceremony?
The last post. Last post is always my favourite part. And the bagpipes. And it was really nice hearing the speech that the Turkish president said when they had one of their first memorials about how there's no difference between Johnny and
Mehmet.
yeah,
Yeah.
you died here now, so you're all our sons. Considering we invaded, that's really, really nice. It's probably the best part.
Did you come with friends or did you travel alone to Gallipoli?
Well, I'm here with Kontiki, which is a New Zealand-Australian tour group.
Tour, yeah.
But I came over by myself and joined up with them.
That's nice.
Yeah.
And now you go, after this, you go back to Istanbul? Or?
Yeah, tonight we go back to Istanbul, and then our tour is over and I go back to my job in Scotland.
Oh, you came from Scotland?
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm doing a working visa
okay.
in the UK,
Mm.
and I got time off, so I thought, come do this. Always wanted to.
So was it as you expected here?
I didn't really have any expectations.
No.
I had no idea what I was walking into.
It's such a big thing, you
Yeah.
know, the Anzac and Gallipoli.
You hear about it all the time, but it makes no sense to me at all. I don't understand why they didn't just turn around when they first landed in the wrong spot instead of sticking it out for 8 long months.
Yeah.
And so many people dying for no reason, like just pure bullheadedness. But
So
at
the
least-
young people in New Zealand think it was a big mistake, the landing and joining the war, basically. Was it?
No, I don't know if they think that joining the war is a big mistake. This campaign was, from the start, not good. They were supposed to land, I think, further up north, where we possibly would have come around,
Yeah.
rather than coming up and just that happening. It's different times back then. I don't know if we'd be so quick to jump into another war. Like if England said, come on, join us, I don't think Australia and New Zealand would be so quick these days as we were back then. But each of our countries had only been colonised for like 150 years at that point. So
You know,
it was-
here in Turkey, there's a big thing about giving martyrs in wars. Is it similar in the Anzac legacy, like the martyrs for the country?
Yeah, we've got quite a few Anzac heroes. Like,
You call them heroes?
Yeah, we call them our heroes. Yeah. It's like, the guy Simpson with his donkey. That's a big one. You're taught about that from like,
School.
yeah, primary school all the way through. And, yeah. The Anzacs are like gods. Kind of, it's how they talk about them, is that they're gods. They came over and it's the first time New Zealand and Australia stood on their own 2 feet as colonial countries, and it's the first time they kind of got that camaraderie between each other as well. They talk about it like it was a massive thing. But then you hear about it from the other side, where we were invading someone else's country because someone else told us to. It makes you think slightly differently about it. Because sure, they were still brave. Well, they were probably more stupid than they were brave. A lot of them came for an adventure. They didn't know what they were getting into. They thought this will be fun.
Yeah, they thought they would see the world.
Well, apparently John Simpson, when he joined, he was broke and he just wanted a free ticket back to Europe. He lasted 3 weeks. He was only 22. Yeah.
How old are you?
24. It's eerie.
Yeah.
But I look around and I'm like, at least they died somewhere beautiful. New Zealand's a very, very beautiful country. At least they got to die in that kind of beauty here as well.
So, as you can see, quite a different perspective. It's now getting on to 7. Do you want to say anything more about that, or we open it up now?
I think we can open up to discussions.
Yeah, I'd be interested
Yeah,
if
would
you
be
had
interesting.
any questions or comments or whatever about any of the subjects that this film raises. Okay.
Please wait for the microphone.
Yes, hi, my name's Lisa. I just want to congratulate you and thank you for the film. I've only seen a part of it, but you recognise immediately that it's absolutely masterful, and I'm looking forward to coming back and seeing it in its entirety. Look, I'm 60. I grew up in a small country town in Australia. I remember marching in Anzac Day ceremonies with actually World War I veterans. It's a long time ago, but I do recall that. I have 4 children who are now in their late 20s, early 30s. They were educated at a time not as well educated as the young New Zealand woman, obviously, because they grew up at a time when, you know, they really didn't know anything. They hardly studied history. And they would probably go to, one of my sons has been to Gallipoli, but as a tourist, as you talked about. So my question to both of you is, do you actually think, and Marilyn, you seem to imply that a little bit of disapproval of the museum that's currently just about to be opened in France, do you think we're better off not to make the films, not to build the museums? You know, because of the emotions and, you know, not necessarily always positive that are being generated as a consequence of all this commemoration?
I think the more education, the better. I'm into the practice of education, and in fact, history. One of the grounds on which there were four of us wrote What's Wrong with Anzac, critiqued the mythology, was we said we wrote as historians. And there's such a sort of gap, an increasingly big gap, between the history, as it were, of World War I and, you know, what happened and why we were there and why the Anzacs were there at the behest of the British, etc. There's such a sort of gap between the history, which many, many historians point out, and the stuff of mythology, which is all about how our nationhood was established on the 25th of April 1915, which is completely crazy because our nationhood was actually established, you know, in 1901 when Australia became one of the most advanced progressive democracies in the world, with, you know, women's rights and minimum wages and shorter hours and public ownership of utilities and old age pensions and, you know, like all of those things established a quite distinctive identity, both for Australia and New Zealand, I should say, so that people came from across the world to look at these state experiments, as they call them. So there's a big sort of gap between the understanding of history that comes from particular military commemorations, I think. That's what I worry about. I think we can't just assume that military commemoration is history. You know, as someone, I think Richard Flanagan recently in his press club speech said he sees the $100 million museum at Villa Bretonneux as a museum of forgetting. In other words, in commemoration there is always marginalisation of other stories, forgetting of other aspects of history. You know, we shouldn't sort of be naive, I guess, about what commemoration represents and the way that commemoration changes and shifts all the time, which the dramatic example of Turkey in the last 5 years. So you want to say something?
I mean, my take would be, for example, when I embedded myself in 2016 with the Fanatics group for the dawn ceremony, there were two parts for me. The beautiful part and, for me, the more boring part, which Marilyn tried to explain, the state control, the mise-en-scène, the narratives. What was very interesting in the dawn ceremony, has anybody been to dawn ceremony in Gallipoli? Okay. I mean the one in Gallipoli, on the beach where the Anzac is. Yeah. So 2 years ago, this is what I experienced. There's a beautiful moment. It's very important that you are actually going there at around 6 o'clock in the afternoon. You see the sunset, you sleep, you are in the place where these poor soldiers were sent to. And you see the topography, and you spend a night there. Well, this is a pilgrimage, a real pilgrimage, like the effect of going to Mecca. It's that spiritual. Now, this is something else, and doing it in Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne is something else. There comes a point, the organizers have arranged something quite very modest, in my opinion. Before the ABC starts their live coverage from Gallipoli, Anzac, they slowly light up the Sphinx. They slowly light up the sea, the waves. This is a small intervention of the state, but it's aesthetically also beautiful. I was moved. Also because how Turkish people, the Turkish state celebrates is completely different. You know, loud, selah, putting the kids in the henna, feeding them something. It's just this rush. You cannot feel the experience with this rushed, dictated movements. But then, in the Anzac ceremonies, immediately when the old man came to the stage, and he said to all these young people who actually were hanging out there with their sleeping bags, it's really freezing cold, and he literally says, hey guys, shape up, get up. You're gonna be on TV. This is exactly what you hear. It's never on live TV. And ABC starts, and this woman comes, the speaker, and she starts this, you know, patriotic speech, and it turns to something completely different. So, how and when should we celebrate? How do we stop celebrating? Now, if this is as beautiful as that, the first few moments of the Anzac dawn ceremony, and also if you go to the topography where she is now, I mean, she's having a different experience. Let's face it. I mean, she's being emotional for a reason, because she's seeing this view, and then people who go there, they see, this is the Anzac, you know this. This is where you sleep, and this is where the stage is, thank you, happening. And then you go up the hill, and this is the Sphinx. I'm standing right next to the Sphinx. I didn't go on the Sphinx because I would be afraid it would, I would damage, because there's a lot of erosion there. So this is the point of view of the snipers of the Turkish army. There were maybe 40 or 50 who were on a daily basis killing very easily these preys. Unfortunately, we have to say that word. I mean, it's really, this is why the Turkish narrator was saying, we call the Anzacs as the deceived. So this is a different experience. When you see this, it's a different experience of a commemoration. But when you do it in Sydney, Melbourne, you go to this organized ceremony, it's a ritual, it's a completely different idea. As to your questions about making films, films should always be done, but it should be done from two perspectives, or three if there's a third one.
Well, I have actually one comment and a question as well. So, first of all, about the mothers that you were talking about, I found probably I should start with saying that the film looks fantastic. I'd like to see it. Haven't seen it yet. So. I found your conversation quite interesting about mothers and the role that they play in commemorations in Turkey as opposed to Australia. I found that fascinating too. It's easy to see there, I think, the tropes of excessively emotional East and rational West, but you know, I'm not buying it, to be honest. I think there's more to it than that. I think one of the reasons for that probably is that in Turkey, these crying mothers and sacrifice of the mothers is pretty much about the present. You know, I think it was very interesting your discussion about conscription and the role that mothers played in that. In Turkey, women are still pretty much in that situation because they can vote, they can supposedly make change, but at the same time they're expected to sacrifice their sons to, I mean, there's compulsory military service, and anyone serving in the army is likely to engage in warfare. So that's something I think very much about presence and why people would emotionally react to stories about mothers sacrificing their sons. Makes sense in that context, I think.
And if I could just, there's a bit in the film where one of the women sort of jokes to a friend, and they say, be careful, you might fall over or something, and she said, oh, that would be a small sacrifice. I would then become a martyr like my son is a martyr 8 years ago. And so it's very much in the context of current wars, indeed. Yes, your point.
Yeah. And my question is, again, about martyrdom, somewhat related to this. I saw that the title of the film, in Turkish, it's Şehitler, and English is Heroes. I just wondered about the choice of translation, because I think martyrdom doesn't translate shahadet so much, but at least it's somewhat, the religious tone is there, and because the ideology of martyrdom in Christianity doesn't quite overlap with Shahadat in Islam. I was wondering,
It's exactly how you explained, because we discussed within ourselves, within our groups. I discussed with people in Turkey, academics here, people from the War Memorial. As you say, martyrdom is different in Muslim cultures, is different in Christian cultures. And then there's the third aspect of the secular, more secular ideologies or cultures. So I agreed with many of my friends who are writing about this as well, that what we call Şehitler, martyrs, corresponds to more the heroes in the Australian, New Zealander culture and history writing.
But I in fact, agree with you. I said earlier to Köken when we were having a conversation that I don't think heroes and martyrs are the same. They're different constructs, and heroes works for the Australian part, maybe, but martyrs certainly doesn't. Because the very idea of martyrs and martyrdom begs the question, martyrs to whom? For what? To what cause? People are martyrs to a cause. And it's easy enough to see in the Turkish situation, that they might see that they're martyrs to the cause of Islam or the nation or whatever. But in Australia, they weren't martyrs to anybody. I mean, they went as they saw it for God and empire. That back in World War I, that's how Australian boys thought of what they were doing, as all the contemporary graves and monuments and writing shows, they went to fight for God and empire. So I agree, and I think it's a really, because I think the differences and the discursive differences are really as interesting as the similarities. Yeah.
Sorry. You qualified the notion of martyrdom in the case of Anzacs, and I totally agree with this, but I think in the Turkish case, this notion of shahadat goes, unfortunately, unquestioned often, so maybe it would have been useful to open that to question as well. So, yeah, I just wanted to, have a...
Yeah, no, it raises a really important point, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Köken, you and I have had a conversation a couple of times about all of this, but the other people haven't been privy to it. I went to the Australian, Turkish, New Zealand, British and French government 75th anniversary landing at Gallipoli in 1990. And that was probably the one and only opportunity where Gallipoli Australian and Turkish Gallipoli veterans attended. Regarding Australians or Western people not crying, Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister of Australia, was there, and he cried at about 4:20 in the morning.
He always cries.
Yeah, well, this was just after his famous Tiananmen Square presentation to the Australian government, where the Chinese students got run over by tanks in the square, and he had a big cry on television and all this kind of stuff. So at the time, I was with the International Press Corps as a photographer, and we were corralled up the back a little bit, away from all of the dignitaries and the other attendees. And the International Press Corps were actually running a book on exactly what time Bob Hawke was going to cry. And it was about 4:20. Anyway, preceding that, I met with the Australian government people, and there were 34 returned veterans, or whatever you want to describe them as. I met them somewhere around the Golden Horn or whatever, and we went for a boat ride in the Bosphorus. And all of the government people were at the back of the boat having a party, having a barbecue and drinking beer and whatever. And inside the boat, the 34 diggers were drop dead, pin drop silent. They were sitting in the boat, looking out the window, looking at their destination of 1915 that they didn't succeed in establishing. But 75 years later, they were silently going for a boat cruise looking at this.
Yep.
That was the day before Anzac Day. Something like 3 o'clock in the morning, I had the experience of standing on the beach and in the water with some other idiots. And then there was the 4 o'clock dawn service. After that, there was a midday service at Lone Pine, so you know everybody went through the rigmarole again. And at the end of that service, we all got shunted off somewhere else to a big open space where there were very large tents, where Bob Hawke, Turgut Özal, is that his name? The
Yes.
president, whatever, of Turkey, Margaret Thatcher, and all these, yeah, I know, all these kind of people were in attendance, as were the 34 Australian diggers, the majority of whom, well, no, about half of them landed on April 25, on the actual day. The youngest was about 91 or something, and one old fellow was about 103 or 104. He had the birthday on that day. And one of the most extraordinary experiences of that was that the Australian diggers, these veterans, were introduced to some Turkish veterans. And there was quite an extraordinary demarcation between the two, and both governments and all the minders, they were prompting these old soldiers to get together and shake hands and embrace. And still after this time, there was an incredible reticence to get close to each other and do that, to the extent that some of them had to be forced to do it. Yeah. And then there was a dissolve of difference or whatever, and everyone started crying and all this kind of thing. So I just wanted, because we've had a couple of conversations about things, but I haven't told you more than, don't do that. A longer story. I just thought you'd need to.
Yeah, that's interesting because I didn't, of course, experience this time. I mean, was it at Anzac or was it not at Anzac at that year,
well,
the ceremony?
In 1990, the ceremony was Ari Banu. So now it's at North Beach,
yes,
right under the Sphinx, but it was a little south at Ari Banu, which is where they first landed, climbed up the hill, what's called Plugs Plateau or something.
Yes.
It's just next to Lone Pine. There was a very large open, not Lone Pine itself, because it's so small, but it was a large open space. They had the tents and whatever. So you could overlook the cove and the sea, and they had Australian warships there, because Bob Hawke was staying on one of the ships, as opposed to us in tents and whatever. So the sea line was effectively covered with ships, like it was in 1915, from this particular viewpoint. And then you had literally the Turkish brass, the Australian brass, the Kiwi brass, like literally bands plus all the military officers and all this lot, and the government people. So it was a big.
Could I just say something about the 1990 event and Bob Hawke going, which has now entered history, as it were, it often used to be said that Bob Hawke was the first Australian Prime Minister to go to Gallipoli for Anzac Day, which, is itself sort of interesting because, it's about the sort of trough in Anzac Day commemoration and then the resurgence, and often it's said that Bob Hawke's visit marks the beginning of the resurgence in 1990. But in fact, when I was having a look at this and I wanted to check this, interestingly, he was preceded by one other Prime Minister, but way back, and that was Stanley Melbourne Bruce in 1924. Now, there are two things that are interesting about that. First of all, 70 years pass, when no Australian Prime Minister or other political leaders go there. But secondly, why Stanley Melbourne Bruce, you might ask? He had fought at Gallipoli, but as part of the British force. He enlisted in Britain. You know, he was well known to be British to the bootstraps. And so that too was interesting. So he went back as a returned soldier, actually, as part of the British force. So in that sense, Bob Hawke was the first, as it were, Prime Minister to, you know, go in a quite different context. And yeah, I think what you said is interesting and incredibly moving, those old men, you know, in their 90s to be confronted with that again. How incredibly moving that must have been.
And they were very silent.
Yes,
for the whole
yes.
time. A lot of people were falling all over them and propping them up,
Yes.
and this kind of thing. But they were, of course, very much not lost in their thoughts, but very deep in their thoughts for the whole time.
And also sort of sad being forced to reconcile too. I mean, that's a sort of interesting example of the gap between a sort of official...
They volunteered again.
Yeah. And the gap between the official thing about reconciliation now and Johnny and Mehmet shaking hands and all that stuff, but them not feeling comfortable, they didn't want to do that. It's such a sort of rich story you tell us, yeah.
This question, please.
First, I'd like to say congratulations on the film. I really enjoyed it. I really liked the style of the documentary being mostly observation, and I kind of imagined what a Michael Moore version, a Michael Moore Turkish guy might have done with that documentary, and I was very happy to see the style of it. I've got a few questions. One's a bit silly and the other two are a little bit more serious. The first question, which I'll do, which is the silly one, is was there any footage that just ended up on the cutting room floor for the sake of moderation that you just couldn't use because it would be too sensational? And the next question I was going to ask is, it's a bit of a comment as well. I was very interested in the film, the part that had the corporal Seyit, and he's carrying the shell on his back and his ribs are cracking. I found it very, very similar to Simpson and his donkey.
He is the Simpson of the Turkish legacy.
Yeah, I was half expecting you to bring that up as one of the highlights of the film, because that for me was like, oh yeah, there's like a real simple narrative that people can get their heads around and get very emotional about there. That leads on to the next question was, I haven't really studied history, but I kind of thought Ataturk had quite a large role in that whole campaign, and I was kind of curious how he managed to not appear or be mentioned at any stage.
In this film?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start from that. I mean, he is mentioned by most of the tour guides, of course, but there is also critique against the last 5-7 years that his narrative is being diminished or kind of pushed under the carpet. But there are also big discussions with the historians in Turkey saying that he was actually one of the heroes of the Gallipoli front, not only the one. So I think in the state narration or the myth making, legend making, it's always easier to pick one or two people. So you hear it's John Simpson who has been picked, who I believe was English, who wanted to return to Europe, get a free ticket, a deserter, exactly. And then there is the Corporal Seyit, who's the hero, and they have T-shirts of people you see in Istanbul streets carrying that. He's a youngish male figure, strong, so it's very popular among women, especially in the film you see women touching his sculpture in a very almost like erotic way. And then Ataturk is the hero. But I think I agree with the historians who are contesting that. He's not the only one. So I think it's easier and it moves people because he is still the figure in Turkey that is irreplaceable for many people. Even Erdogan is now, mentioning him because we think he wanted to become the next Atatürk, but I think he's trying to gain more ground now, and he's been losing some support, so it's such an important figure that you cannot ignore, so he started talking about him as well. What did I omit from the film? This is 10% of what I shot, so I omitted a lot of things, but not because they would be controversial. There were very crazy remarks by some tour guides, but you could see them, they're almost lunatics. So in a film of 88 minutes, I had to be fair and give a nice, give a thorough impression of this. I still put some of the lunatics. For example, the guy who holds up his Samsung mobile phone and he says, "Our Turkish children must have done this. The Koreans did it because we saved them from the Korean War, in the Korean War." So he's one of them. But he has stronger narratives, but I picked up because I don't like to go to the extremes too much. But at the end of the film, you see the extremes. There are these notebooks which are revealed where people are almost cursing the way that we're writing commentaries against your blog, for example. You ask a question in the middle for Marilyn or me?
Can I just say something about
Yeah,
your
please.
comparison of Simpson and his donkey and Colonel, was it Said? I should speak to this. Who, for those who haven't seen the film right through, he's depicted as this really, really amazingly strong, super masculine figure who lifts up, is it a shell or something, and his back breaks, but because it's all about how on earth the ships managed to, how the guns managed to defeat the British warships. Like, it's a superhuman effort, and it's depicted intentionally as a superhuman effort. But so that it's a sort of really superhuman and rather macho. Simpson and his donkey, though, is a really interesting figure because, and when I learned about this stuff at school, there was a focus on Simpson, but he was a rather feminine figure because he was compassionate. What Simpson did was he was a stretcher bearer, and he was really brave because he would go out in the fighting and pick up the wounded and bring them back in. So he was always thought to be a rather soft, feminine, compassionate figure, whereas these chaps are thought, seen to be like really, really masculine. So I thought Simpson, in fact, there's a book by Peter Cochrane about Simpson, the legend of Simpson and his donkey, and he emphasises what a sort of, unmilitary sort of type chap he is. He's a sort of, and he, for those who don't know, he was a deserter from a British ship in Melbourne. Or so. He jumped ship and joined up in order to get his way back to Britain. Sort of started off ignoble, but then becomes a hero in his compassion.
One question I have is, I haven't heard of Corporal Sayet before, but has he been a figure in Turkey for a very long time, or has that been something that's been created a myth of?
No, it's not recent. It's not.
This is him, isn't it?
Yeah, this is him trying to.
He has to lift this incredibly heavy.
Güç ver bana, Allah'ım güç verseydi. Allah'ım güç ver bana. Allah'ım güç verseydi. Haydi Allah'ım güç verseydi.
I'll show you his picture. So apparently, immediately after this incident happened, the myth is that he was being photographed. And this is the most important part of the story, that how come he lifted that big shell, sorry. He couldn't lift it up when they wanted to take the picture, so they had to empty this is him. They had to empty this was for the Turkish Life magazine, kind of Hayat magazine. It's actually called Hayat magazine. So this here, he's lifting it again for the camera, but they had to empty the shell because it was too heavy. And the myth is like this is a sculpture of him, some little town somewhere. There are sculptures of him everywhere. So yes, after Atatürk, he's the second figure of this, and he's a more public figure, right? And there's been a lot of discussion about like his posture is this, present posture, but in the 60s, he was carrying the shell like this. And they commissioned this sculptor to do this, and then the public says, no, he has to carry it like this. So this sculpture has actually a court case with the state of Turkey, because this was replaced and this was put instead. And then he got back to the court and he said, this must be because this is an artwork that I did. But the public knows it as this. So here in everywhere in the world, everywhere in Turkey, you see these things and these character of many, many things, as you see here.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's so prominent.
You see, there's merchandise, so it's a industry now. Yeah. There was one more question.
I think Marilyn mentioned something about being careful about perceiving military military commemoration as history. And I was going to ask how balancing all these multiple perspectives, as you alluded to, influenced actually a creative process in coming up with the ideas for your films or any other pieces that you work on.
Can you open a bit more, please? Yeah.
Because it seems to me that if you take the narrative given to you from the military as history, that creates some sort of a myth. I think that's what Marilyn was maybe alluding to. I feel like the same thing can happen with media, with exhibitions, with museums that we do perceive, in the sense that what is on display, what is exhibited, is some sort of narrative. And the same is true for films and documentaries. So I wanted to know, in your creative process, how you kind of navigate these perspectives, because for sure in this sort of thing, you're looking at the Turkish perspective as well as the Australian perspective. But obviously, again, you said you had a limited run time, so you have to cover these perspectives in a fair way to kind of, I guess, hammer home the narrative that you're not on one side or the other.
Yeah, how do you deal with all those conflicting...
Yes, I mean, there is a weight of the artwork who can become a myth it is a commissioned work. Of course, Leni Riefenstahl's works is commissioned by the state, but they became signature things about masculinity of the Nazi Third Reich. It matters how frequently this work is shown, and will it be used by institutions as a new myth-making narrative. As long as I am alive, I will stop it. It's been represented in that way. So in the contemporary art world, I trust that it's not going to be happening. But when you talk about the more straight control aesthetic creative products, they are kept as mandatory or repetitive that everybody can see, as these audiences here. They're subjected to it. You can't miss it. But whereas a film like mine will be shown in Artspace today, will be shown in New Zealand the other day, in Turkey, and maybe some film festivals, and then it won't be shown unless a state official says this has to be shown at every school in Australia. Like Marilyn was talking to me when she first saw the film, she said, I wish this film is shown in every school. But that is in the control of the Departments of Veterans Affairs and the National Education Councils. So, okay, I mean, there is a danger of every artwork becoming, a myth-making device. I hope it doesn't become like this. What this kind of films contribute to the whole idea and concept of Anzac and Çanakkale legacy would be to present a different angle. And I think there should be more and more different angles. So then the audience will see the war memorial, will see a very critical academic, read books, and then see this film, and then construct his own ideas after these. It's, I think, it's a better process. If I could answer.
Can I just ask you in return, have you seen the whole film?
I hope to.
No, but it's interesting you say that, because that was exactly one of my questions and interests too. What's the narrative here, if you like? But there is no narrative ostensibly. There's no narrative voiceover telling you. It's not a Mike Moore film. You just get you see, clearly it's edited and, you know, only a tenth of it goes on film, but nevertheless, I'll be very interested when you do see it as to what you think the narrative or point or meaning of it is, because it's not told to you.
Yeah, I was always more interested in how this is perceived and told, but not, I wasn't interested in the accuracy, historical accuracy. I'm taking it for granted that the Anzac legacy here exists today, and I'm looking at how in present day it is performed, represented, and how it is absorbed by the audience. So my work is a bit more about the public's reaction to it, or the mass public.
Yeah. And hence all of those shots, quite long shots of all those old ladies crying.
And close-ups.
And close-ups, yeah.
I know that people have more questions,
Yes, but
we've
we have to wrap up.
We've run out of time.
We'll talk outside. We'll talk outside. We'll have a drink. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So let me just, okay, great. I just wanted to thank Marilyn and Köken. Thank you very much for your time and for your really engaged debate, and they'll still be here if you want to keep talking. Hang around. Thanks. 12th of May.